Yes, I'm delighted to be joined by Lexie Alford, probably better known as Lexie Limitless, who is a very popular travel vlogger and also, I guess, kind of blogger, because you do quite a lot of things on other different social media platforms. You're probably best known for being the youngest person to travel to every country in the world. I think that was in 2019 you got that when you were 20?
21. Yes.
21, oh right.
96 countries by 21 years old.
I mean, I guess the obvious place to start, just because it's going on. How has the pandemic affected you? You're saying you're still managing to travel.
Yeah, well, it hasn't been a very great year to launch a travel YouTube channel. But overall, of course, it was as difficult as any small business working in a pandemic. But as slowly we started figuring out how to adjust different travel regulations, and some countries started opening up, myself and a lot of other travelers, travel vloggers, have slowly started to learn about the regulations. We get regular testing, so we've adjusted to the new norm, I suppose, and are trying to still make the best of, seeing and sharing as much of the world as possible.
How does it differ? Do you have to do like a test before every airport or a test before every country? How is kind of the practicalities of it work?
Yeah, so we do. The regulations depend on by country to country, but for me personally, I get tested before every trip, and then sometimes after I get there or in the middle of my trips, and then again before I take a flight to leave. And then once I return to my home, my destination, I'll get another test once I get there as well.
I guess sort of you go for countries which have more liberal restrictions at the moment, which kind of
Yeah,
limits you a bit, but you can still make it work.
yeah. So there are it's a very small list of countries that you can currently travel to, especially on a U.S. passport. We went from having one of the strongest passports in the world to one of the weakest. So we've been, slowly countries like Turkey, Iraq, Mexico, places like that are opening up towards U.S. tourism, and I've been trying to make the most of that.
Yeah, cool. I mean, if I'm right, the your rollout, vaccine rollout is going quite well, if I heard correctly. So I guess that will be kind of expanding quite rapidly over the coming months.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very excited that I'll be eligible to get my vaccine soon.
So how did you get into traveling? I read online that it was because your parents were travel agents. You kind of started with them and then got into it that way. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I started traveling when I was very young because my mom has a travel agency of her own. And thankfully, growing up, they would always pull me out of school and bring me with them on their adventures. And I ended up graduating from high school a few years early and getting my associate's degree from a local college. Then I had the dream of taking a full gap year. And I had been saving up since I was really young to take this amazing gap year, travel around the world. And during that gap year, I started picking up my camera and capturing my experiences, sharing them online, and the rest is history. It just picked up from there. And that's around the time I was around 18 years old when I thought of the idea of traveling to every country for the first time. And once I got it into my head that there was also a world record that I could break simultaneously, I knew I would regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't try.
How much did trying to break the world record kind of like affect your plans? I mean, were you sometimes trying to sort of spend relatively short amounts of time in certain countries just so that you could, sort of pick them off, as it were? Or were you still able to spend quite a long time getting to know places?
Yeah, well, my priority is always to spend as long as I can in each place, and especially getting as far away from the capital cities as possible, because I think that's where you can really get the best, most genuine glimpse into the authentic culture of the people who live there, seeing all of the amazing landscapes. But of course, because I had this goal of traveling to every country, and I was, budgeting and paying for all of that myself, I didn't get to spend as much time as I would have liked in a lot of different countries, because it's actually the least visited countries in the world that are the most expensive to travel to.
Oh,
So, 3 days in Afghanistan will cost you roughly the same amount as 3 weeks in Indonesia. So it really came down to being a budgeting thing. So traveling to all of these countries on a shoestring budget ended up being pretty tough at times.
yeah. And what's the process of getting a visa like for somewhere like Afghanistan or Somalia? So one of the places which are less visited by Westerners?
You have to jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops. That was by far one of the most frustrating aspects of traveling to all of these different places, and that's coming from the perspective of someone who has a very privileged passport.
Yeah.
So I had to get a few dozen visas for various countries, but they are expensive. They can range from 100 to 250 US dollars. You have to go to in-person meetings. You have to apply through different embassies around the world in advance. The Afghanistan visa, for example, I was originally denied when I applied in Dubai. So then I had to go to Abu Dhabi and try again. And it's really just like a massive jigsaw puzzle that you have to figure out logistically how to get to these places.
I mean, are they all tourist visas, or do you sometimes get some kind of like work visa, or aid visa or something?
Yeah, it was definitely a very situational thing. It depended on the country. I would usually apply for tourist visas, but in some cases, for example, I was hired as a photographer to come to Yemen with a Norwegian guy who was writing a book about the country. So I was able to get a business visa, get media permits to be able to photograph the country and things like that. So there are a few countries where I did go from tourist to business visa, but usually it was tourist.
I mean, I remember Drew telling me that to get into Libya, he had to pretend to be like an oil executive or something like that. There was some strange story about that.
Just made a YouTube video about that yesterday.
Oh, wow.
About how funny it was to have to tell the Libyan immigration officers that I was working for the Libya Council of Oil and Gas because they don't actually issue tourist visas right now, given the state of the civil war there. They're obviously not prioritizing tourism at this time. So, but there's always loopholes, especially if you never take no for an answer.
I mean, so what? One thing I say, I love travel blogs, so it takes me places I haven't quite got the guts to go to myself. But one thing I love about your videos is you always try and incorporate the local. I think that's a really interesting way of doing it. And obviously, you've done some videos where you really focus very heavily on like a community, like the Yazidis in Iraq. I mean, is that something you always try to do subconsciously? You always try to focus on the people, or did you kind of change as you traveled more?
Yeah, well, I think that one of my absolute passions and favorite parts of traveling is being able to step into other people's shoes and to feel like what it is like to live from their perspective. So that's always been a priority in my personal life as far as traveling is to experience these other cultures because I think that travel is the number one catalyst for creating empathy around the world, which is something that we definitely need a lot more of. And being able to capture those experiences and these people's ways of life is my favorite thing to do. And I think that through my videos, I'm able to share a lot about these communities that, in the United States and sometimes in Europe, people have never even heard of.
Yeah.
So I really like being able to spotlight and showcase those kind of communities.
I mean, is your kind of fan base quite internationalist? As in, do you mainly get watched by Western people, or do you have lots of people watching in Pakistan and India and Indonesia and so on?
Yeah, I've got a pretty diverse audience, but of course, because I speak English, my audience is primarily based in the U.S. and in Europe.
Yeah. I would say, but one other thing I saw you did, I saw you did, I think you fasted for Ramadan or something. So it's kind of going along with the
Yeah, definitely.
sharing different cultures. But is
Yeah.
that quite an important part of what you do, trying to extend cultural awareness, or does it almost come inevitably with the job?
Yeah, well, it's something that I'm personally very interested in is experimenting with all of these different cultural experiences and religious experiences like fasting for Ramadan. But I also have a lot of fun doing it, and I think it's beneficial for both people who don't know much about that culture to see someone doing, and it's also pretty fun or entertaining for people who are a part of the Islamic faith to see a Westerner trying it for the first time. So yeah, no, it's very fun, and I've got a ton more ideas
Yeah.
like that for the future.
But I've spoken to a few travel bloggers kind of over the past few months, and what quite a few of them have said is that they're surprised at how quickly the world has been changing. So, because obviously in kind of Western countries, we don't necessarily know so much, but like some African countries, some Asian countries have this phenomenal rates of economic growth, or did before the COVID pandemic, far outstripping anything in Europe. And kind of the pace of change is something that you only really experience when you're there. Is that something that you would say you'd felt?
Yeah, I mean, the world is definitely changing a lot, especially because of social media. We're so much more connected than we have ever been before in history, which I think it's been really beautiful. And from my perspective as a traveler, especially as I started becoming more active online, I started being able to use it as a tool to connect with people and meet locals that I would have never otherwise had the opportunity to do. So I think it's actually really helped traveling because you have the opportunity to connect with so many different people.
Have there been any countries that have really surprised you, like kind of more than others?
I've had a lot of very surprising experiences, and some of the countries that ended up being my favorite that I've ever traveled to, like Venezuela, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, these kind of really off the beaten path places that a lot of people are honestly afraid of visiting because of what
Yeah.
they hear on the news. Those countries, because I had such a not like a low expectation, but I had just no expectation of what I was going to find there. When I eventually arrived and was greeted by so much curiosity and hospitality, and I saw these amazing landscapes that I haven't seen a ton of photos from before, like the Colosseum in Rome or the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It just felt like it created such an authentic experience that felt like it was uniquely my own and shared with the people that I was with. So, yeah, going to these really off the beaten path destinations is definitely my favorite way to travel.
You may not be able to answer this, but I mean, when you're going to somewhere which is potentially dangerous, like Yemen or Afghanistan or something, I mean, are there kind of security precautions? Do you speak to the local American embassy or the State Department, or just hope for the best?
Oh, yeah. So, can you hear me? You cut out a little bit.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You can
So
hear
sorry.
me?
Did you hear the question, or
Yeah,
sorry?
yeah, I got the question. So I have a bit of a checklist of things that I do to prepare to go to these kind of places.
Yeah,
One part of it is the logistics aspect, figuring out how to go there, what regions in the country are safe, which ones are not, and lining up any necessary security parameters. Or I usually, when I'm going to like quote dangerous countries, I make sure that I have a local guide that's going to
yeah.
be with me the whole time. They're planning on picking me up from the moment that I make it to the airport, from the airport, and to never be just, showing up with my backpack and wandering around the streets at night, those kind of things. And then also back to that social media and networking connection, it's always good to connect with people who have recently been to Afghanistan or Libya or Syria or something like that, who can share their firsthand experiences with you about what it was actually like on the street and what connections they made that would be helpful for you to have during your trip. So it's really just networking and logistics that help with going to these kind of places.
Are you kind of ever surprised by the reaction you get as a Westerner or as an American? Do people have views about the West that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to have?
Well, I think that actually it's Western people who have this idea that, especially Americans, think
Yeah,
that when they go to these very random places, that the locals are going to have a negative view of Americans, but from my perspective, I've only been met with curiosity. Sometimes they'll crack political jokes or whatnot, but I've never felt like discriminated against for being an American. I've always been feeling very like welcomed. And at the end of the day, when you're traveling, it's what your national identity kind of is goes out the window, and it's just person to person. So I haven't felt like, it's been a crazy thing traveling as an American.
It sort of seems like there's almost like a small community of travel vloggers. So I think some of you guys work together. Is that kind of right? You guys, as in ones who do it sort of professionally, do you like discuss different countries and talk quite a lot and try and collaborate, or is it more just a couple of you do it?
No, well, it's actually, yeah, a pretty small community of people who are working in the online travel space. So we are all pretty connected. We all know about each other. We all watch each other's videos, and we also collaborate from time to time because that's just mutually beneficial for everyone. And yeah, no, we all keep in contact, and it's pretty fun.
I mean, would you have been able to, because obviously you said you started saving when you were quite young, but would you have been able to go to every country in the world without kind of earning as you went, without doing vlogging or blogging, that kind of stuff?
Well, I was slowly figuring out a way to pay for it as I was going. So that helped me a lot, and especially during the first few years, I would go travel for a few months and then come home and
Yeah.
work, my local jobs when I was still living in Northern California. So then I was kind of figuring out how to work when I get back, then travel again. But then as I started picking up my camera and creating content, I was able to travel while working, which is a big breakthrough that I reached, and knew that whatever I got to do to make this my full-time job is what I'm going to do.
I mean, does most of it come from kind of adverts? Because obviously, YouTube adverts, Facebook adverts, or sponsored posts. How does kind of the breakdown work?
Yeah, so for me personally, it's different for everyone. Like for Drew Binsky, for example, I know that the majority of his income comes from Facebook and YouTube advertising. I would say for me, it's a pretty healthy balance between the YouTube advertising and other brand sponsorships, brand partnerships. But yeah, and then I'm slowly expanding into having my own products. Like for example, I'm writing my first book right
Yeah,
now
I heard
about
about that. How's that going?
my first book about my experiences and everything I learned traveling to every country. So that will be both a physical and a digital product that I will be able to have to offer to my audience, and that will be there forever and will support the other videos and the other adventures that I'm going to be sharing online in the future. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting business model for these creators online, and there's really no limits to what you can do with it.
But obviously, having been to every country, is your plan to start going back to countries again and start seeing them in more depth? Just carry on traveling.
Yeah, exactly. So there were, of course, it was almost felt like traveling to every country was having a sampler platter of the whole world. And now I know a very specific list of places and experiences that I want to go back to again and again. And it's shifted my perspective from traveling to each country because it's a country, rather to going to each place because there's a specific experience that I want to document. So I'm going very much more to experience-based travel.
Okay. And obviously, I've noticed you've been doing some sort of, I don't know if it's slightly more long form stuff, but like certainly stuff you did in Iraq, for example, with the Yazidis. I mean, almost sort of mini documentary type stuff. Is that something you're sort of kind of constantly trying to do more of, or is it just that happened to work for that situation?
Yeah, it really depends on each situation, but I really loved focusing on a specific group of people. I have an upcoming trip. My next trip is in April, and I'll be spending some time with some very interesting communities in Ethiopia, which I'm very excited to be documenting. But yeah, I love I'm still very new to creating videos and short films and everything like that. So I'm really just experimenting with a lot of different styles of content right now.
And they're all really well shot and edited. Do you do all the camera work and editing yourself, or do you kind of have like a team or someone back in America doing it for you?
Yeah, well, thank you. I have been shooting and editing everything myself, but one thing that is nice again about collaborations is that you can work with a lot of different filmmakers,
Yeah,
and I'm slowly growing my team and having an editor and everything like that. But for the first, 15, 16 months that I've been on YouTube, it's been basically just me and my camera.
yeah. Honestly, you mentioned the Yazidis. I mean, I've noticed something that generally travel bloggers try to avoid. I mean, for very obvious reasons, it's kind of anything that touches on politics. Obviously, you want to be able to travel anywhere in the world. If you start running
Mhm.
off on that, that will restrict it. But I mean, when you met the kind of Yazidi community, I mean, were they still were they happy to talk about what happened with ISIS, or was it very much, they'd rather keep that in the background?
I think that they were very open to sharing their story because it's almost, amplifying these voices that very rarely get to be heard in person. So
Yeah.
I found that people are very open to sharing their perspective even when it relates to something painful that's happened in their recent memories or in their history.
No, I do think, because as I say, you mentioned earlier that it's quite a small community of you, the kind of professional vloggers, I suppose. Um, I mean, are you surprised there are more people doing it? And you think there might end up being a bigger number?
Yeah, well, I mean, it may
Not
look
to
pretty.
encourage the competition.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think there can always be more travel creators, but it's
Yeah.
also it looks easy, but it's a pretty hard job and it's very exhausting.
Yeah.
So I think once people, dip a toe in how much work it actually is to coordinate these productions, to script, edit, and film all of these on your own every single week, or in some cases every day,
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's a lot of upkeep. So it's got quite a high barrier to entry, and I think that's probably why there aren't more of us.
Obviously, we only see kind of the short video, but presumably behind the scenes, are there days of work that goes into each video, or is it
Oh
um,
yeah, definitely.
including like the getting the
Enough to
visas
be
and the
a
traveling?
full-time career.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I say, this is perhaps slightly delicate. I want to ask about safety, because obviously, obviously you're very young, you're female, which I would have thought makes it worse, but I'm not an expert. I mean, how much do you have to worry about that stuff? And presumably it's kind of always on your mind.
Yeah, so it is because I'm a young woman. Safety is something that is on my mind regardless of where I am in the world. Unfortunately, this is that's the thing about harassment of women is that it's a universal thing that
Yeah,
is experienced around the world, regardless of what culture you're in or where you are. So it's something that female travelers have had to work with forever. And I have two specific rules that I have for solo female travelers that have kept me safe going to all of these places. And rule number one is to not get intoxicated because
yeah,
drinking or doing anything while you're traveling, while you're by yourself doesn't it's not always very fun, but it's definitely something that's easy to avoid and it can help keep you in control of your surroundings and just being aware. And the second is that I don't go anywhere by myself at night. So I plan all of my days around arriving back to my hotel or something where I'll be spending the night right before sunset. So those are two pretty strict rules that I have for myself, and they've been tested and they've worked out so far.
I mean, when you speak to kind of like your male counterparts, the people like Drew, I mean, are they taking similar precautions, or is there something really quite different about being a woman traveling?
Yeah, well, I think they have a bit more of a gray area, and especially with things that they don't even notice. For example, Drew and I were walking around in a market in Iraq, and he was filming something and leaned over and asked what I was thinking about the situation that we were in, and I told him, well, I love it here, but of course it's 99% men
Yeah,
in this market on the street right now. Like you might not be aware of it at all. He didn't even notice that there were no women
yeah,
anywhere on the streets. So I think male travelers can be almost a bit oblivious to what it must be like to be a female in some of these situations
yeah.
because it's just something that they've taken for granted their whole lives.
I mean, are there kind of like other young or female travelers generally, but like you guys keep in touch and kind of share tips,
Yeah,
or is it more part of the bigger overall community?
yeah, no, there's a lot of amazing female content creators who are traveling the world. A lot of them do it solo, and yeah, no, I'd say there's starting to be more females doing it than
Really?
males. It's amazing.
I mean, one thing I've noticed, this is just my perception, but it seems there's a lot more people from countries I mean, developing countries who are doing a lot more traveling. So I've seen all sorts of travel vlogs pop up where it's someone from Indonesia, it's someone from India, it's someone who, perhaps 10 years ago you wouldn't necessarily have expected to be traveling the world. And obviously they got, a very tough job with passports, getting visas and stuff. I mean, is that something you've been seeing and kind of, more and more creators popping up? And so especially from countries you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of people traveling from, countries that do have a harder time because of the
Yeah.
strength of their passport. Our friend who is in Iraq is actually traveling the world on what he calls the least powerful passport, which is the Iraqi passport. And
Oh wow.
managed to travel to 75 countries on his passport, which some people view as being completely impossible because even from the perspective of being a local in a country like Iraq, the media tells them that they aren't able to go to these places. So it makes them not even want to try to obtain these visas. And of course it's a huge headache, but if you're willing to put the effort and the time into procuring some of these visas, you'll be able to have these experiences for yourself. You just have to unfortunately, put in a bit more work than other people have to.
Yeah. And presumably, in ways you make quite a lot of sacrifices. So obviously, I presume you didn't go to college. A lot of the normal things young people do growing up. Is that kind of how you look at it as a cost benefit? So obviously, you obviously you'll miss out on some experience. You'll have other really amazing experiences other people won't have.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so over the past few years of traveling, I was rarely staying in one place for very long, which became somewhat isolating. I definitely got pretty lonely at times because when you're traveling for a few years at a time, then you start to lack a sense of community, which I realized was something that was really important to me. So it's been recently, especially over 2020, is coming back home and developing this sense of community with people from my home base and then also going out and traveling. So I've been finding a bit more of a balance.
Is that the kind of balance you want to keep going forward? Kind of like a mixture of like a strong home base and then traveling out from that, rather than being
Yeah,
on the road all
exactly.
the time.
Exactly. I've
So,
gotten the majority of my solo adventures out of my system, I think, for the time being. And nothing, I personally really love doing group trips and group travel because you get to share these once in a lifetime experiences with someone that you can then later reflect on once you get back home, which is pretty great.
yeah. We'll say, Lex, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. But yeah, no, thanks a lot.
I appreciate it. Thank you.